A couple of things that we'll go through these slides. So the aim and goal of this, we'll be going through a few different definitions as well as like indicators. So when we're in flow, when you might be in a hyperfocus state or otherwise. And then lastly, we're going to tie it up with some examples. Hopefully we're going to have a better idea by the end of our exploration of the examples and deep dive into some of the definitions or examples. And you've got some idea that where you can place in your life, or you've already had experiences very similar. I'm sure you have, but that'll come to mind towards the end. That's my hope. Excuse me. All right. So what is flow? This is a little bit of a longer definition. You can feel free to read this, but I'm going to give you my personal definition. I'm based off of my the way that I envision it. So if your brain was a car and you had all your cylinders firing off with gas and NOS, and extra nitrous in the tank, your tunes are going off on blast as well. So everything in this car is going at full volume, and you're just having this exhilarating experience. That's flow in a nutshell. If your brain is that car, it's at the peak of its performance and it's very seamless. There's nothing else that's going on. You're a one focused machine, and you're speeding off the racetrack. So outside of a little bit of the definition, some of us might have a little bit of a greater itch in your cranial area. So what we have written here are a couple of markers of flow state. So you get an influx of neurochemicals you may be familiar with. Dopamine, which are dopamine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and anandamine, serotonin, endorphins, and those are all part of different regulatory systems for your brain, whether it be tied into your adrenal system, fight or flight, your decision making, which is on the last bullet point. There's this notion of your lack of prefrontal cortex activity, which is in charge of your decision making. And there's this concept, if anyone feels like doing their own research on transient hypofrontality. What this is in particular is just your prefrontal cortex shutting down just enough so that you can flow through multiple decision points rather than being stopped at a moment where you have to overthink yourself. So we're going to use an example here. This is a very colloquial phrase for those who have maybe played guitar or been in a band. This phrase, "in the pocket," this is a phrase that refers to when a lead guitarist is playing a freestyle solo with a live band. So the solo is completely improvised, and where this meets flow is there is a level of technical expertise that needs to happen while this guitarist is playing. They also have to be cognizant of their surroundings in terms of feedback of their rhythm with the drums, and maybe some stage presence between other parts of the band, the bassist, the rhythm guitarist, or even the crowd. But two parts that are really happening on the same side of flow here are a high level of technical skill play. You're going to be technically sound and musically in tune with everybody else, but at the same time, you're still able to explore creative pathways while maintaining rhythm and etc. So it's very seamless in the form of mastery that it is. Our second example here is in the tube, another example for surfers, in particular if anyone surfs. My understanding of in the tube is this idea of when this wave collapses, and let's say, hopefully you guys can see my cursor here, is when a surfer is in a wave. This is a semi-collapsed wave. Once it starts collapsing and it becomes an actual tunnel, that's the idea of being in the tube. So what's happening here are a lot of things at the same time. The surfer has to be aware of things that might be happening within the waves, rocks, just reading the wave in entirely, the formation, the curvature, and then that's all external. Then internally, and a little bit closer to the board, they've got to maintain their semblance of balance. But in a state of flow, this happens very seamlessly, and what would otherwise be a very demanding environment to pay attention to a million different things, in a state of flow, it becomes a little bit seamless. All right, and our last case. This isn't as much this is more of a general example, not specific to gaming. General gamers and athletes alike use this phrase "in the zone." Why we're using video games, for example, is there's a really good example for, let's say, first-person shooters, if you will. You're making not only quick decisions, but you're making micro movements and reacting to just pixels on a screen at like crazy fast frames per second. And when you're doing that consistently, and your neurons are just like firing off and rinse and repeat to new environments or whatever the case may be, this would be considered being in the zone, and you can invoke a state of flow with this as well. All right. So those are a couple of examples. Hopefully that gives you a pretty decent idea. They're not all made the same, but they all enter this cognitive state in one way or the other. Some overlap for sure. All right. So if you're in any of these examples, or if you're in flow in general, how do you actually know that you're in flow? Right. Great question. So next, that brings us to our indicators. So these indicators are brought up from Stephen Kotler. He is a big researcher. I believe he and one other writer that escapes me at the moment. He has been leading the charge on education or doctorate, if you will, in papers and journals, et cetera, on flow state. So this is from his website as well. I personally have a different list. There is some general overlap, and why I have a different list is just because of a personal trigger point for what my indicators may be when I am looking to achieve a flow state. All right, so breaking it down into the 4 stages. So the 4 stages are something that's been identified, categorized by researchers when you're I believe it was divvied up by different brainwave states, as well as the indicators that are going to be shown shortly here. So like, let's say here, the struggle stage, right? There's that moment of risk that we're constantly thinking about. The moment before the plunge and making that very first executive decision of deciding that you're going to be doing something difficult. You have this resistance of getting on the horse. You have this resistance of jumping in the pool. You have you're overcome with stress to some extent. Great. So once you're all saddled up, in that moment, once you're comfortable, right? I think you talked about it just a little bit earlier. Once you made that decision, it's this release stage of, okay, I'm here now. That moment of relaxation, when you're downshifting from stress, if you will, and it's like being intensely concentrated, then letting it go. This is kind of like setting the stage when you have this like almost chaotic moment between the decision point of your stressor and your moment of deciding that, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it. And then after that, there shouldn't be a consciousness, really. The little narrator that you have on where to go and what to do next is very silent at this point. So this is the main part here that we got to, the main meat of the sandwich. and you're in flow stage. So the expansion of awareness and capability as our first bullet. This is exampled in all of our previous cases. If we're going with our writing example, if you're going through the woods in particular, this would be a great notion, right? And so it's a little bit easier, I'd imagine, in a flow state to go through woods whereas if you weren't, you'd have to fixate on every single tree and every single path and every single log, and you'd be overwhelmed and burdened at all the things that could possibly go wrong and all the obstacles in your way. Otherwise, when you're in a state of flow, thinking about that shutdown of the prefrontal cortex, you're already making these seamless decisions of which way to go. You're not looking at the trees, but you're looking at the path, and you're just focusing on that, and it's a lot easier to navigate the woods in this example. Hopefully that one made sense for sure. All right, and lastly, we're going to go into our last stage here, which most people, I've heard that most don't consider it when you're talking about flow state in general, and that's the recovery stage. So this is the come down, right? After you're intensely focused, you have to think about, well, there's got to be an endpoint to it, right? Eventually, your hyper focused awareness and your expanded spatial awareness is going to end. You're going to be drifting back into your baseline levels of whatever cognitive state you're in before. So you're just going back into what your normal state may be, and all of your brainwave states are also being regulated in conjunction with your neurochemicals. So all those processes are kind of going back. It's like think about your heartbeat racing in general. Eventually, it does come down, and then it comes down to like a regular pacing of what you are regularly. So in this case, it's just brain. It's like all your brain power. Your brain's got to shut down eventually, and then you have to give it a break, and then you can recover. So some considerations when you're going into flow state or exiting flow state or just going into work mode in general, you have to acknowledge your body's natural rhythms and resources. So what I mean by that, obviously, you have your circadian rhythms. That is your sleeping. Without sleeping properly, you're gonna have a slower digestive system, and your digestive system is going to regulate the actual replenishment of your neurochemicals in your brain, to include the processing of glucose that is much needed for your brain cells to function. All two of them in my case. Your ultradian rhythms are a cousin of the circadian rhythms. This is your neurochemical gas tank, if you will, right? So if we were going to do, hopefully we have some gamers in the crowd, and I'm going to make an RPG reference here. So if you had like a dungeon exploration, and you had to do like 3 dungeons or so, but you have a health bar at 100. After every like a continuous back-to-back dungeon, that health bar is going to deplete. Not in a way that it's like 90 out of 10, but you're going to get 90 out of 90 after the second round if you don't allow yourself certain rest and breaks. That's how you end up burnt out, and then what is supposed to be a 20 to 30 minute nap becomes a 3-hour, 3-hour plus hibernation for the rest of the evening, if you're not paying attention to your natural sleeping states or your natural mental energy, if you will. So that leads down to some strategies. I think that if anyone wants to, I'll look into the Wu Wei in just a bit. I see we have a resource here, but going into that second bullet point, strategies for optimizing the flow state. So this is going to matter 100% on what skill and action that you're taking, and from what your current state is. And what I mean by current state, you have to think about your current health, or what time of the day you're doing it. When's the last time you ate? If it's the first thing in the morning, everyone functions ever so slightly. In a fasting state, you might be able to run on fumes a little bit longer. It just really all depends on what your digestive system is like, in terms of what your diet is regularly. So like some people can go to the gym after being in a fasted state. Some people can't. They need to eat at least an hour prior. So this is gonna matter in terms of absolutely fasting flow state hits 100% different. Between that versus like let's say if you're well fed and then you're working out, going for a run or gaming for that matter, and it takes like 20-30 minutes and then you're just Zoom, next thing you know it's like 3 hours and you've been on back-to-back tracks for whatever accomplishments and trophies you've had. So it does matter, but typically going back to ultradian rhythms, all things considered, and if you are like super healthy or whatever the case may be, your natural come downs are going to be about in 90-minute intervals. So plan those diminishing returns from there. Give yourself a 5 minute break, give yourself a 25-minute break optimally, and play with that. Some people have a longer gas tank than others, but generally speaking, you're going to be working around those 90-minute intervals. So our example indicators, indicator stage considerations, or consideration as a whole. I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to explore a couple of ideas with you. In terms of your personal life, I may be able to give you um, some planning, if you will, maybe some strategizing of in and not just intertwining flow state or more or less or just at all if you're not going into flow with intention. Some people just kind of sift into their work, but you can be incredibly productive if you time lock your productivity uh, surrounding flow state and such. And another thing to consider is, if you need flow state, you might not. You might just you might be trying to uh, get into this cognitive state and might be burning brain power for excess for no reason. Mm.